Okay, so we know that we use our skin for quite a bit of things, right? So it's that outer appearance. We often use it for beauty. We put makeup on it. We pierce it. We shave the hairs on it and stuff like that, right? We do all of that. Something's wrong. Can you guys see my slides?
Yes.
I don't see
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, well, it's down now, but.
Okay, can you see it now? Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. So, but we know that the skin serves other purposes other than that beauty. You know, we always worry about their pimples and stuff like that, right? And stuff, things like that. It's more than that. Just what is it? So what is it? Beauty's only skin deep, right? You've heard that saying before?
Yeah.
Yeah. So beauty's only skin deep, right? So our skin also does other things than just that aspect of beauty, right? So our skin is crucial for us to regulate temperature. It's crucial for protection, right? So when we break down the skin is one of our largest organs, right? You guys kind of recognize the skin as an organ. It's also a system,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay, so if we sit there, we think about it, and what is the difference between tissue and an organ?
Between tissue and an organ?
Mm-hmm.
Tissue is an organ is made up of tissue.
Okay, so an organ is made up of tissue.
And
Okay.
then so tissue is the more elementary like form of an organ, I guess. Is
Okay, so is an organ made up of only one tissue, or is an organ made up of multiple tissues? Because when we talk about tissues, we had connective tissue, we had some muscle tissue, we had, you guys remember, right?
yeah.
Nervous tissue. So is an organ made up of only a certain type of tissue, or is it made up of multiple types of tissue?
Multiple.
Okay, so we know that an organ is going to be made up of multiple types of tissues because we do need that nervous tissue, because we need those nervous cells and stuff like that, right? We need that connective tissue because we need that adipose tissue. So we're going to need all of those aspects, right? So it's going to be important that we understand that when we're starting to talk about organs, we're going to be making up of all of those tissues that we were sitting there talking about before. Okay, so like you're correct. Organs are made up of tissues. We know that tissues are made up of cells, and then we can break down cells to even in terms of molecules, right? So we're building, but because these organs, or these, in this case, we're talking about a whole system, because this whole system is made up, a system is made up of a couple of organs, right? Okay, so because in the case of the tissue, in the case of the organ, it is made up of various tissues that are serving various functions, and they work together as a unit, okay? And that unit has to be regulated. That unit has to have some type of control to do its function. And if we don't have that regulation, then we have issues, right? And that's what we're going to be kind of talking on. And we're going to talk more so on the issues that could arise from this process, okay? Because that's kind of like what we're looking at, okay? Okay, so this here is basically a diagram of the skin. You guys see it, layers, right? So we have the epidermis, we have the dermis, and we have the hypodermis. Epi is typically surface, so it's the top, okay? So at the top of the skin, we have that nice little thick layer of the epidermal layer, right? And we know that that is going to be made up of epithelial cells that are going to be nicely compact. Then we have what we call our dermis layer. The dermis layer is going to be the thickest part of our skin. Now that's going to basically house all of our connective tissues. It's going to house our nervous tissues. It's going to house all of those other tissues together. Okay. We're going to have some glands that are going to be in there. We're going to have hair follicles. It's going to have all of these different structures. And you guys can kind of see all of those different, right? Okay. So, and then we have the hypodermis. So the hypodermis, we're going to have fatty tissues, right? And we're going to have some like loose connective tissues as well too. So that's where we're going to have our basically our blood vessels, things like that. They're actually going to fall within that area as well too. We're going to have some of the sensory nerve fibers that are going to be there as well. So they're going to go through that area as well too. So we have this nice, beautiful diagram showing you kind of like all of the different structures that can be housed in, right? And so this kind of also start explaining what's going to be going on in terms of regulation, right? So we know that we have some nervous tissue. We know that we have the adipose tissue. What does the adipose tissue do? Again,
Stores fat.
it stores fat. So why do we need fat? What is the significance of fat?
Keep us warm.
Keep us warm. Okay, so we use a lot of the fat to help keep us warm. It's also a way of storing nutrients and stuff like that, food for later on. Okay, so why do we need fat in our skin? I just said it.
But to kind of protect us still from temperature.
Okay, so it helps to protect us from temperature, to keep us warm. You just told me, keep us warm. That's one of the reasons why we need it there. So without it, we're not able to sit there and generate heat when it's really cold outside, right? To kind of keep us warm during that time period. So we're not going to be able to sit there and start utilizing that energy that's stored up in the tissues if we didn't have it, right? Okay, so what else? Okay, so our skin does a lot with temperature regulation. How do we cool off in the summer?
Sweat.
We sweat, right? So we have some sweat glands in there as well too, right? So in terms of like say our hair follicles and stuff like that, so what are the hair follicles there for?
Is it to kind of just protect it from like certain dust and?
So hair serves two purposes, right? One of the things is like, you'll notice that there's a general trend. People who grew up in really cold climates typically have a little bit of more hair than others. So it's serving as means of providing some heat in a sense, or in that context. It's also to protect us from, like you said, pollen and stuff like that. So we typically have hairs as forms of protection in that regard, right? Okay. Okay, so let's see. And the nerves? Why do we need nerves on our skin?
Serve as sensory mechanisms
Okay.
when it comes to temperature regulation, to sense the environment around us, so it can send signals to like sweat glands and all those things.
Okay, so sensory, right? Also, we think about touch, right? So skin is also responsible for touch. We need to be able to feel things and touch things and grab things, right? So they kind of send those signals for that as well too. So our skin plays a huge role, right? Okay, so here, this is an example of what we call thick skin versus thin skin. Okay, so the epidermis is basically considered like our thin skin. Okay, so if you guys can see a layer, that upper layer there, that is our epidermis. That part of it is kind of thin. Okay, this here represents the dermis layer, and that part is going to be thick, right? Okay, so that outer layer, although it's nicely compact, let's go. But if we look at it, the epidermis is really a thin layer relative to the dermis layer. That thickness is huge. So, this is just basically a histological slide showing that cross section of the thermal. It's showing you the thickness between the two, so you guys can get an idea. And so you can see some of the structures, although not very well, you know, because it's not stained for that visibility. But the whole point of it is that the epidermis is, although it's a very kind of thick kind of tissue, right? It's kind of strong tissue, you know, it's thin overall, right? I shouldn't say a thick tissue, but a dense, strong tissue compared to the dermis, which is also thick in its structure. Okay. So this is basically a section of the epidermis again. So you can see that the upper layer, you have your epithelial cells, right? And so you just have that nice little layer of cells, right? And then we have what we call the basal layer. So the basal layer are going to exist of our cubital cells. You're also going to have keratinocytes, which basically is responsible for making keratin, right? And so keratin is that protein that's found in basically your hair, your nails, and things like that. So these cells are going to be responsible for, like in the case of our nail formation, the hairs that are going to be that are going to be protruding from our hands and stuff like that. How many of you guys are very hairy? How many of you guys have to shave your legs? Anyone?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right. So they're responsible for the production of like our hair follicles, and then also like in the case of our nail, you know, our nail structures. Okay. So those are. Okay, and so these cells are, their primary function is just to make that keratin. So, and this guy's just a protein. Okay. And so this protein is just, it's a long protein, fibrous, right? And so if you kind of look at have you guys ever looked at your nails? So if you kind of look at it, you can kind of see the lining of your nail, right? So it's like long fibrous structures that kind of compose it together.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So in that context, you guys can kind of see that you have these fibrous follicles that are just basically, like I said, making up that nail, making it hard, right? And it also makes it water resistant. Okay. So that's the same thing with your hair. Is your hair is water resistant? Does your hair absorb water and gets bigger or anything like that?
Well, they say that when you shave, it gets thicker.
But
when it goes
yeah.
back.
You said your hair gets thicker as it grows back?
Yes,
Okay.
when you shave.
Okay. So I should shave my head to get my hair thicker up here? Is that what you're telling me?
Well, we do that for babies when they have burly hair, so it can come out more.
Okay.
And thicker.
Okay. Okay. So is it so much that the hair follicle is getting thicker, or is it just that you're irritating it, and so your body is kind of responding to it? And so as a result of it, since you shave that hair, you kind of irritated the cells at the surface, and so it made it more primed to start producing more keratin or more hair follicles.
Oh, okay.
Okay.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So, and so you'll notice that these structures, the epidermis, is going to be composed of those different cell layers that we have talked about, the skirmish shells, the cubicle cells. And so they're going to be a combination of everything. And so you're not going to have these pure cells that are going to be making up just that layer. It's going to be a combination of different cells, and they're going to serve different roles within that cell structure. I mean, within that tissue structure. Okay. Okay, so these are the different layers of the epidermis. So at the very top, we basically have a lot of our dead cells that have that keratin, right? And so these guys are going to be basically filled with keratin. So these cells basically are no longer viable. They're not growing. So those keratinocytes, they're basically, they have like a programmed death. So they start growing and everything like that. They make enough keratin and then they die. And so, and that's going to be that very top surface, right? So that very top surface is essentially dead cells. So have you guys, do you guys flake a lot or notice that you're dry skin?
Ashy?
Yeah,
Ashy,
my
yes.
hands.
Yes, ashy skin, exactly, right? So those are those keratinocytes that are just basically killed over and stuff. And so they do serve a purpose, right? They have that keratin that's serving as that protective layer, right? And so you're kind of protecting yourself with that dead layer skin, that dead layer cells, okay? So then we have the Stratium lucidum, right? And so right there, those cells Basal. Let me kind of clear this out. So those cells are basically, they're going to be kind of smooth, right? A little transparent. And they're literally the layer that's going to be just directly under that dead layer skin. So have you guys ever scratched yourself? Like you had a little bit of scratch, like somebody scratched you and took off that upper layer skin where you're not
white.
bleeding. Yeah, that part, but not the one that's white, but the part that is just kind of like a clear glossy type.
Yeah, and it gets puffy.
And it does get puffy, yes. So that part there, that's that layer, okay? And then we have our Stratium Grandiosomes, right? So those guys are they're gonna be responsible for, again, they're gonna be grainy in appearance. So if you cut a little bit deeper, right? Just to the point where you're almost gonna start to bleed, right? It's kind of rough looking, okay? Yeah, you should know that I've actually cut myself quite a bit here, right? So, and then we have the Stratium Spanosomes. So these guys, and let me kind of elaborate. So these guys are all kind of carry keratin sites. These are keratin sites that are just, they're live, they're vibrant. They don't have a lot of keratin in them. These guys, they have a little more keratin. That's why they're kind of grainy. And then, so if you think about your layer of skin, as they get to each of the different layers, they're going to go through different stages. At this point, these cells are actually dying. Can you guys see here? The stratium, so these guys, that clear, transparent, so they're at the point where they made enough keratin, right? But in terms of it's how it's interacting with each other, it still has that lucid, so you're able to see through it. And then this guy is where the keratin is really polymerizing it in itself, and so it's no longer lucid. So that's that outer layer of skin, okay? So it's kind of like your cells are going to be growing in layers. So the keratinocytes will actually start to die as they age. As they age, they form a different layer of your skin. Does that make sense? So we have basically 5 layers. We have Stratium corneum. We have the Stratium lucid. So lucid as in like translucent, right? Stratius grandiosomes. Those are going to be the spotted ones. And then we have the Stratius Spanosomes. So those are the ones that are going to be in growth. They're going to be early development. Then we have Stratium basal. Those are like our are early keratinocytes. Okay. And so as they age, they get pushed down further. This is where your new growth is coming. This is where your old growth is. And so it's going to be pushed. So then you lose those layers, and then you have cells that are going to be taking that place. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Mhm.
Make sure not forgetting anything. Okay. So let's talk about, okay, and then we have melanocytes. So those are going to be the cells that are going to be adding color to us, right? So I have a lot more melanocytes than you guys do. That's the back of the skin. My beautiful brown tone there. Okay. And so those guys are going to be responsible for providing protection in terms of protection from sunlight. And so those are also going to be part of this complex of cells that are going to be there. Okay. So this is just basically a cross-section of a real epithelial cell. So you can kind of see the different layers in this picture. It's not the best picture. I need to see about better picture. Only go with what I have right now. So. Okay. So this guy is the layer of the dermis. Okay. So we have, basically two major layers, right? So we have the papillary layer and we have the reticular layer. Okay. So the papillary layer is basically going to be kind of, it's going to be that loose areolar connective tissue, and so that tissue is going to be kind of loose. So you're going to have like some collagen in it. You're going to have the elastin fibers in it. You're going to have, and it's going to make a nice little mesh. So that layer is right here. This cross section is pretty good. So it's going to have those fibers of collagen and elastin, right? And so we know that collagen, you guys are familiar with collagen, right? What does collagen do? And what does elastin? What is it? Is it a protein? Is it a cell? Is it a
protein?
It's protein, right? So collagen fibers. You've heard of collagen before?
Yes.
So what is collagen for?
Doesn't it give strength to like tissues?
Joint.
What was that?
Doesn't it give strength to like tissues?
It does provide, it provides some supportive means, yes. So
Yeah.
it will say it has some support. Have you heard of people getting collagen injected in their lips?
Yeah.
Yeah. So why do you think that they inject their lips with collagen?
To make them more supple.
Okay. So they become a little more compressive, spongy, right?
Puffy.
Puffy, right? Okay. So
Like blowfish.
yeah. So if we think about collagen, right? And if you feel your skin, feel your arm, right? So when you press on it, what happens to it? You press on it and you let it go.
It turns like white or like a lighter color for like a split second.
Okay, so we get a change in color. Okay, so what else? In terms of that texture, what does it feel like? Press your lips, because your lips technically has a lot of collagen in it, right?
Squishy.
What was that?
Squishy.
Squishy. Okay, so it kind of does in terms of that compression, right? So we have elastin and collagen that are kind of like, they're proteins that kind of give you that squishiness, right? But at the same time providing support, right? So it's not like, have you ever filled say a balloon, right? So if you fill a balloon with Jello compared to a balloon filled with water, anybody put Jello in a balloon?
No.
No.
Okay,
I
but you
put
play with
water.
Jello. Yeah, you play with Jello, right? Have you guys played with Jello? Touch Jello?
Yeah.
Okay, so when you touch Jello, doesn't it have that sponginess,
Yeah,
Yeah.
that bounciness.
that bounciness, right? And if you touch your lip, isn't it kind of like how you're touching that Jello, that bounciness, right? So the upper part of the epithelial, that part there, it has that kind of like that sponginess, right? So you have those connective, that collagen, the elastin in there. Elastins are basically, you know what elastic is? Like
Yeah.
the elastics that's sewn in your pants or in your shorts. What is it there for?
Expand.
And then
Contract.
contract. So it's able to expand and contract, right? So elastins are proteins that are able to expand and contract. And so your collagens are just kind of like that cushion as well, right? So it gives you that cushiness feel. And then the elastins are the ones that are going to be able to expand and contract. So your skin, in a sense, expands and contracts, right? So the dermis allows for that expansion and that contraction, right? Okay. And so that layer there is responsible for that first part of expansion and contraction. Okay. So the reticular layer, so that is going to be composed of irregular connective tissue. And so that's going to house basically all those nerves, and so in a sense, that upper layer of the dermis is going to be kind of like a cushion pillow for protection, right? So like a pillow kind of is used to protect the head, or like if you guys have a helmet, don't they have the foam pads in there that are kind of cushy? Any of you guys wear a helmet to go skating or baseball?
Yeah.
Anybody play? Okay, so the inside of a helmet has that cushion. So that layer is kind of like that cushion. The papillary layer is like the cushion. And then this guy is where everything is kind of housed, right? So that's going to have your irregular tissue. So that's going to have your nerve fibers. It's going to have some adipose tissues. It's going to have your sensory thing. And so this guy is serving as your protection of that next layer. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Okay, so also in this layer, we're going to have protective cells. So cells that are going to be for defense. So those are going to be our immune cells, right? So we're going to have phagocytes. We're going to have things like that in this layer here. So this layer, again, protection, right? So it's going to protect us from things that are going to be on the outside, as well as protect the inner part of it, okay? Okay, so the reticular layer is also going to have some of the collagen and also some elastin, right? But again, you're going to have primarily this part of it here is going to be that denser part. That layer underneath, it's going to basically be a mesh of everything that's going to be existing there, because that's where like the work is going to be done. It's going to be rich with sensory and nerves, cells. So it's going to be responsible for doing a lot of the sensing underneath. Okay, so then we have the hypodermis. Okay, well, this is basically just showing you pigmentation. So how pigmentation is kind of controlled. So we talked about the melanocytes, right? Melanosomes, melanocytes. So these are our melanocytes here. Okay, so these guys are going to be responsible for making melanin. And so these melanocytes are going to be basically secreting that melanin, and this melanin is going to go through are going to be they're going to be taken up by the keratinocytes. And so somebody like me, I'm going to be producing a lot more melanin. So my skin tone is going to be a result of the melanocytes producing the melanin that is going to be uptaken by the keratinocytes. Then as those keratinocytes die, that melanin is going to be spread over it. So you guys can kind of see the development here. So these guys are called Melanin Zones. So they're just like, they're a huge vesicle of melanin that has been uptaken by the keratinocytes. Okay. And so somebody who has lighter skin, they're not producing as much melanin. And so they're not going to have as much melanin being secreted out as in the case of somebody like me who's dark. Okay. Now, those skins are capable of producing melanin, right? And so sometimes in the case of a mole is an example of when one of those melanocytes basically goes kind of out of control and they're producing too much in a general area. Okay, so if we go here, oops, carried away. So if we go here, you guys can see the different moles. So in all of these cases, these guys are melanocytes that have become melanomas, right? So, and if you guys can take a look, so these guys are considered benign. So they started to grow, but they're not growing too fast, right? And then these guys are considered to be melanomas, where they're kind of growing out of control. Okay, and so they're growing way too fast. And so these guys are the ones that are going to have to be removed because that's a form of cancer. So anytime that you see OMA, that makes reference to a cancer. Okay, carcinoma, melanoma.
Does our body produce that in response to UV exposure?
Yes. So too much UV exposure could end up in the development of cancer. So that's why they say you're not supposed to be sunbathing all the time. You know, particularly people of lighter skin. So, and it's funny because your body is trying to compensate in a sense. You're getting too much sun, so its response is, okay, this guy's getting too much sun. Let me produce more and more melanin because the melanin serves as protection, right? And so, but the problem is that it gets out of control. It starts producing way too much. Does that make sense, Alex?
Yeah.
So, and that brings us back to that concept. So what happens in the case of sun, you're getting UV damage, right? And melanin is supposed to help prevent some of that UV damage. And so it's part of its job. So like in the case of, they say Black people don't get sunburn, right? Well, we get sunburn, but it doesn't affect us as much. It's because we have the melanin in our skin tone. We have more melanin available than the case of a person who's lighter skin than us, right? And so it kind of protects us from that UV damage, where in the case of somebody who's very fair skinned, or like an albino who's not able to produce melanin, right? So in those cases, then those individuals are more prone to cells being, cancer cells being, or melanocytes being produced, and then those overproducing, and then they become cancerous. And so somebody who is like an albino is going to have issues because they're not able to produce the melanin. And as a result of it, they don't have that protection. And then it keeps bombarding. So the cell says, okay, there's a lot of sun. So as a result of that, I'm going to try to produce more and more of these cells. So then those cells start going out of control, and then they end up with a skin tumor. So does that make sense?
Well, the cells have to become mutated, right? Like it's
right.
Essentially a mutation.
Yep. So what happens is that UV light causes damage to the DNA. So UV light will actually fragment the DNA. The DNA is always trying to repair itself. So it'll start repairing itself, but it's not really paying attention to how it's repairing itself. So it'll connect things that are not supposed to be connected. So what will happen is that cell will lose control because those fragments are there, and it's reconstructing those fragments in the wrong way. And so you'll end up messing with what they call tumor suppressor cells. So tumor suppressor cells are tumor suppressor genes. Tumor suppressor genes are genes that actually are responsible for suppressing tumors. They keep the cell in check. Okay, so you've screwed those guys up. If you screw those guys up, then you don't have the things that are supposed to keep those cells in check. So sometimes there'll be the cyclins. There are other proteins that are made as a result of those genes. So cyclins are one of them. Signaling cascades, RAS. There's a gene called RAS. So it's known to also cause cancer. The BRC is an example of a tumor suppressor gene that kind of went crazy, right? So those are certain genes that are responsible for keeping the cell under a tight control in terms of growth. If you screw those guys up, then there's nobody to keep it in check. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And UV light actually causes DNA damage. So that's what's really happening. Your DNA is being fragmented, damaged, and then the cell is trying to fix it because it doesn't want to kill it unless it has to, especially if you're getting a lot of UV damage, because it is saying, hey, we need those cells because we don't have enough cells to replace it. So it's going to try to repair as much of it can. And so it's going to do the best job it can. But when it does that, then it causes damage. People who basically lay out in the sun a lot, tan a lot, then they have the possibility of causing that damage to themselves. Make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So we've talked about albinoism. So albinoism basically is people who are unable to produce those, either the melanocytes are not able to produce melanin, or they lack melanocytes. So, or those cells just die prematurely. They don't develop completely. So there are essentially two types of forms, right? But then there's also vitiligo. Vitiligo is basically where the melanocytes in a certain area, they stop producing melanin, or the melanocytes themselves actually die. They terminate in certain areas. And so this is an example of vitiligo, where a person, and it usually happens over time. So a person may, when they're young, those cells are able to develop okay. And so they seem fairly even, although it does happen in young people as well too. But as they begin to age, certain people will start developing spots. They'll start off with little white spots in area, and then they'll become even more apparent. And so those melanocytes are either they're dying, or they stop producing melanin, right? So they have two options. So you could get early death. And so if it's early death, that often causes high incidence of tumor development, right? Because you no longer have that melanin there to sit there and protect at all. And so in those areas, you could be prone to getting tumors. Or, as I said, you basically produce melanin, but you produce it so low, or you produce it minimally, right? And a lot of times this is a result of the cell itself kind of attacking itself. So it'll attack a region. So it'll be like an autoimmune defect associated with it. And so the persons, as a result of it, they'll be packed on their skin. Okay. Are there any questions on that? Pretty straightforward. Okay. Okay, so the hair follicle. So this is just basically a hair follicle. And if you look at it, right, it actually goes through the different layers, right? And so it'll be the hypodermis, the dermis, and then the epidermis. And so here, this is basically going to be our hair shaft, right? And then this will be the root. And you notice how, like, have you guys pulled your hair? Like I always play with the hair in my little beard here, right? It took me a long time to see it. It took me a long time to get this to grow, right? This is now it's about a year of growth that's gotten it this thick. Now, when I pull it, does it hurt when your hair gets pulled?
Yeah.
Why?
Because it's rooted deep in the skin.
Rooted deep, and what's also connected to those hair follicles?
Nerves.
Nerves, right? So we have some of those nerves and stuff that are going to be attached. So we have that mesh of tissue that's going to be associated with it, right? Because hair acts as a sensory. When you guys have you brushed it, brush your mustache there, Alex. Does it tickle? Do you feel it?
Yeah.
Can you feel it on the inside? Right? brush the hairs on your arm, right?
Yeah.
So in that context, we have all of these tissues that are going to be associated with that hair follicle. The hair follicle acts as sensory for us as well too, right? And so it's going to have a lot of other tissue and tissue types that are going to be associated with the follicle, okay? So and you'll notice that almost every picture that we've seen, we always have a Sabaculus gland that's going to be associated with it, right? So an oil-producing gland. And so we need that oil in a sense. That oil serves as a purpose of helping that hair go through the dermis. So it's kind of like, have you guys ever, let's see, what do I use? Have you ever tried to stick, like I stick tubing into like rubber or stick a tubing structure into something else? And so when you're trying to stick it in there and you're putting the two tubes together and you're rubbing them together, it's really, really hard to do it. You guys don't have anything on them. So I'm trying to give you an example. So like, so I'll often try to, like, I fix my washing machine, right? And my washing machine has this thing called a bellow that's underneath, and it's a tubing. And then there's a connector and another tubing, right? And those two tubings have to come together. And it's really, really tight because we want to keep a tight fit so that the water doesn't leak out, right? So we're connecting one hose with another hose directly, and then we have a clamp on the outside of it. Okay, so when we're first trying to put that hose on, man, it is hard to get that hose on, right? So often we'll use something as a lubricant, right? So your hair follicle is actually going through the different layers. It's going through the part of the dermis is going to be going through the epidermis, right? So as it's going through, it's going to want to go through like hair growth. You guys, you feel your hair growth. Do you not feel it when it grows?
No.
Especially when you're young, right? When you're young, do you feel it like that first hair growth when it's trying to work its way through? So none of you guys are young, obviously, right? You don't remember when your hair was first growing out?
No.
You don't?
No.
Okay, I do, man. So it doesn't hurt, but you feel it, right? There's a little bit of, and then sometimes we get it to the point where the hair doesn't want to go through the skin.
You get
right?
ingrown hair?
Yes, and we get that ingrown hair, exactly, right? And then we definitely start to feel it, right? So part of this lubricant is to help that hair make its way through, right? So it's working its way through the skin, through the dermis. And so it's part of its job is to act as a lubricant so it goes through easier and you're not having to work so hard to get through, right? But what happens in the case of the ingrown hair is the hair gets kind of stuck because you're not able to necessarily get through the skin. You get a lot of oil starting to produce through here, right? And then as a result, we end up with pimples, right? A zit, exactly, right? Okay, so we know that this guy, it serves a purpose. Part of it is act as a lubricant. It's also to be able to produce oils to sit there kind of protecting us against other things going through. So if we have a constant flow of stuff going through here, it's hard for something to kind of make its way back, you know? So it serves kind of a protective role as well, too. And we've talked about that before. Okay, so.
Why do we have less hair now than before? I mean, if you believe in evolution, why has evolution deemed
so do you want me to tell you what
hair?
I think because I do believe in evolution, and part of it is because we are not exposed to the environment as much as we were when we were at that stage, right? So at that stage we were constantly outside. We didn't have air conditioning, and so we didn't have the need. We don't have the need for hair as much, right? Because we have AC, right? We have an AC heating system.
Mm-hmm.
So we can kind of keep the temperature the way we want it all the time. So there's no need for us to sit there and grow a lot of hair because we're not trying to protect ourselves in the winter, right? And so you just need a little bit of hair. You need a little bit of hair for a little bit of protection, right? So I think as a result of
because so you're saying because we've gotten smart enough to build shelters, etc.
exactly, yes. And I think that over time it starts to, so your environment will affect how those genes are turned on and turned off. Your body isn't going to make anything that it doesn't need, right? It's going to start cutting that down. It starts recognizing, okay, wait a minute. There are signals that are received from outside that says, okay, it's cold, dude. It's really cold. So we need to start growing a lot more hair, you know? And we need to start using some of that fat. And so as a result of that, we start making, our body starts trying to make those adjustments. Now, of course, we can screw it up because, you know, we don't pay attention to our body a lot of times or ignore our body. You know, that's kind of like in terms of overeating, right? So I don't eat as much fat as I have on me right now, but I think with my own head, and then I eat when I'm stressed, and I eat with this. And so my body's like, dude, you're stressed. So let's eat because, you know, we need that energy to sit there and be able to run because you're stressed, right? And so I'm fooling myself because I'm stressed out about work. I'm not stressed out about an animal trying to chase me down, right? And so as a result of it, I'm not using all that energy that I'm storing, but I still manage to maintain being stressed, right? So my body's confused. It's like, hey, you told me that we have this animal chasing me and you just keep putting on this fatness, right? And so, and then all I do is just keep storing it. So those factors, those environmental factors play a part in our body signal and what's going to happen and what's going to be turned on and what's going to be turned off. Does that make sense?
So, I mean, in that sense, can our offspring inherit certain genes that we turned on ourselves through stimulus? Like, so,
yes. Yes.
Like, for example, muscle growth, certain things like skin, like you talked about turning on genes, you know,
yes,
melanin production, all those things. So then how much of that is actually then like written in our DNA when we pass it on to our offspring?
So that is a very good question. So there is a couple of groups that have been studying this for quite a bit. So what happens is that, so let's say your sperm cell, right? Your sperm cell basically has gone through and it programmed, right? So as whatever you're going through at the time, right? You're setting up a program of certain things that are going to be turned on, certain things that are going to be turned off. And so as those cells divide and everything like that, it keeps those programs. Okay, we want to make sure that this guy's turned on, make sure that this guy's turned off, because obviously the body's done this for a reason. And so let's say you're going through a lot of stress at the moment of, you know, your conception, right? And so your body's going to remember all of those markers, those things that are going to be turned on and turned off during that time period. And so that programming is going to be there. That programming is going to be passed on for your chromosomes. So you're going to be providing a set of chromosomes that are programmed already. And so then your wife is going to be doing the same thing. So when you guys come together and you get that fertilized egg, it's going to get a combination of programs that are from your wife and from you. And so your kid's going to have some of those traits that are going to develop. So you can pass on some of those tensions as well to your child. And so those first few cells and everything are going to have that same type of programming that you had initially, because it's going to have that memory of what was turned on and what was turned off. So, but there is a point, there was thought to be a point where it can change that programming. Over time, the individual's own personal experience with the environment will reprogram it, return it on and turn it off. But you're kind of programming your kid for those programs, right? So that's why they say that, you know, let's say you're a heavy drug user, right? Drug use causes certain things to be turned on and certain other things to be turned off. And so chances are, because of that heavy drug use, you start becoming addicted. You have this addictive personality. That child is going to have, especially in that very beginning, that same addictive personality. Okay, so unless the environmental factors change, that child is going to have a high probability of being addicted to the same drug or the desire for the same drug. So does that make sense?
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's pretty interesting.
It's really cool when you think about it, because things are being controlled at a gene level, right? And you're passing those genes onto your kid. So when you want to think about having kids, if you're planning it out, you want to try to do it in a point where it's a low stress point of your life. You're happy, because you don't want to pass on all of those bad things. They also say that a person who is prone to like violence or violence, we'll just say violence, they can pass that on to the child as well too, right?
Is
Not
that
only by
why-
their action.
Just kind of like it's probably similar to that, but sometimes when people have their second child, because their first child was never really planned, but their second child somewhat was planned. Is that why the second child is kind of like very hyperactive?
Yeah.
And like no cares at all.
Yeah, exactly. Yep. And like you said, because that first child wasn't planned, and so they were all wild themselves, and then that first child is probably going to be wild just like them. They're going to get those genetic traits. Okay, so let's move on with some. So, but if you guys kind of see, there's really a general trend about regulation. So there are ways of regulating. So we're regulating at a genomic level as well as regulating at a cellular level. And then we start talking about tissues in the organs. So there's levels of regulations that are going to happen. And all of these guys are going to be. This is just basically the hair follicle, right? So you guys can kind of see. So it's this component of the hair follicle. So there's the hair follicle. Here's the little bulb. Okay. So the nail, right? So this is basically all of the different components of the nail. Again, we're not going to worry so much about it, but you can see you have the dermis, the epidermis, the dermis. So this guy is called the phallics. And so this here is the nail body. This is the actual nail. So that's going to be composed of that keratin, right? And so again, this is going to be regulated. So you're going to have more. You notice how your nails grow? Do your nails grow when you're under high stress or low stress? Does it grow faster or slower?
Low stress.
Your nails grow better when you're under low stress?
Well, I think because when you're high stress, some people start biting them, and
oh yeah. Well, let's assume that they don't bite, right? If they didn't bite them, when your body's under a lot more stress, you're going to be producing a lot more keratin and stuff because your body's thinking, I need to protect myself, right? So your mind is saying, hey, that stress is causing some issues, right? So your body's saying, okay, there's an animal coming after us, right? So why do we use, what is the significance of a nail? What do cats use their nails for?
Scratch.
Scratch. Why do we use our nails? In theory, it's a form of defense, right? So we're going to be using this as a form of defense. Although our nails are not as rigid and hard as the cat, but still it's going to be used in that context. So stress conditions should increase growth, right? So when I'm stressed and my hair starts growing like crazy, well, it grows and falls out very fast too, but it'll start shedding a lot more, but it grows. My nails grow, right? So it also kind of depends on the type of stress that I give myself. If I'm not eating healthy, then I have really poor hair growth, right? But if I'm just stressed, so then my nails grow and everything like that, and I may shed a lot more because I'm stressed, and so my hair may come out a little bit faster because I want to be quicker, right? So your body will make the adjustments according to the things that it's sensing. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So that physiological response, a lot of our physiological responses are our body thinks simple, although we're very complex and our society has changed. So early society, we're hunters, we're gatherers. And so what do we have to be concerned with when we are hunters and gatherers?
Predators.
We'd have to be concerned with predators, right? Predators or things that or prey, right? So we were either chasing something or, And so our body had very simple responses to worry about. Now, as we've developed into a more, a more
Complex.
a more humane society, right? So we don't worry about, hunting our food, right? We don't have to go chase out the cow. We just go to the supermarket and get the cow, right? And so we replace those stresses with other stresses, right? We substitute that stress of that boss yelling at us. Why in the hell haven't you got this done yet? This was due last month. This, if you don't get this done, you're losing your job, right? So then what do? Or an instructor yelling at you. Why in the hell are you getting an F in this class? You need to do better. Why haven't you been doing your homework, right? So we sit there, we make that substitution. And as a result of that, our body starts to regulate as a result of it. We don't understand, our body doesn't understand the difference between when we were the hunter and gatherer and when we were in the office and being yelled at because we're doing a shitty job.
Dr. Henry, is it true that your free edge of your nail is composed of dead cells?
Yes. Yes. Because remember, we were talking about that keratin. So it is, as your cell grows, it gets more and more, you have more and more dead cell. Yeah. So, but all of it, like the majority of the outer layer of your cell, that nail is going to be dead cells. Yeah, this guy is going to be more dead. It's going to be more apt to break because it's dead. Where these guys are more newly dead. Does that make sense? Okay. So we have all of these glands that are going to be responsible for various things, right? So we have our eccrine gland, sweat glands. So our sweat glands, they're responsible for making sweat. We know why we need sweat, right? When do you sweat?
When hot or exercising.
Okay, when we're hot or exercising. Any other times?
When the temperature goes up.
Okay, so when the temperature goes up, okay, so primary thermal regulation. Do you sweat any other time?
Nervous.
When you're nervous, right? You're getting ready to ask that girl out for a hot date. Hey, and you're like, she's gonna say no. I know she's gonna say no, right? You're starting to sweat a little bit. Hands get a little clammy, things like that. Okay. So there are kind of two sweat glands. We have the one that is just kind of responsible for just that general regulation. So that's these guys. That's the eccrine glands, sweat glands. And then we have the apocrine sweat gland. So those guys are going to be more associated. So these guys are just kind of in your pores generally, right? So they're alone. These guys, the apocrine sweat glands, these guys are often going to be associated with hair follicles. So, like sweat in your armpits. You guys ever see my shirts? It's always wet, right? The sweat in your armpits are going to be these guys because those guys are associated with the hair. And so any area that you're basically going to have hair, you're going to have these glands. And then everywhere else, you're going to have those glands. So those are like general cooling. Okay. So when you get sweaty hands, right? Which ones do you think those are? The palms of your hands are all nice and sweaty.
Eccrine.
What was that?
The eccrine sweat glands.
Okay.
There's no hair follicles on our palms.
That's right. You don't have hairy palms. That's right. Okay. Okay. So let's see. Let's see. Okay, so we've already talked about the different functions of cells.
Why do actual micrographs look nothing like the like graphs, like the graphic graphs?
Because they've had time. So in the case of the drawings, they're so beautiful. They try to make it so clear. But reality, right? This is what we actually get. And so when we do those cross sections, because you're cutting cell and cutting tissue, you're cutting layers of tissue, right? Those cuts actually kind of warp it. And so they kind of say, okay, so this is what it really should look like based upon that warping. And so they just try to make it a little bit better, you know?
Use their imagination.
Yeah, yeah. Okay, so our symptoms, right? So there are certain receptors in our skin that are responsible for our sense of touch. And so one of those receptors is called, I may butcher this, the Meissner
Corpuscle. Corpuscle.
the mesocarpuscle. Okay, so this guy is kind of like, it's considered, it'll also be called the tactile corpuscle. And basically it's responsible for our touch itself, the sensory of touch alone. We also have another one called the Parsonen corpuscle. So this guy is going to be responsible for like vibration. So this guy is going to sense vibration. And this guy is going to sense touch. Okay, does that make sense? So like in our fingertips and stuff like that, we can sit there and distinguish, or if like we put our things, we can sit there and feel the vibration. So that's what these guys are. And then the ones that to get the touch, sense of touch, that's what these guys are going to be for. And these are just basically receptors that are going to be in the skin. So those receptors are going to be sending signals, you know, to everything else. Okay, does that make sense? So we know that the skin has three major roles: protection, sensory, and thermal regulation. Okay. And so during each of those, it's going to have different functions. So touch, sensory. So these guys are going to be responsible for that sensory component. We talked about the protective part, you know, protecting us from the UV, the keratin, stuff like that. And then we have thermal components, right? So our thermal regulation. Okay, so when we want to retain heat, when it's cold, right? So then our basically our blood is going to kind of circulate, but it's going to circulate lower. It's going to try to keep that heat, kind of retain that heat. It's not going to circulate at a higher level, right? When we're trying to cool off, what we're going to do, we're going to basically use the blood as a way of cooling our system as well too. So how many of you guys have a car?
I do.
You have a car? So do you put antifreeze in it?
Yes, for the summer.
For the summer. Why do you put antifreeze in your car?
To keep the air running cold.
Let me see.
So it helps it with the AC, with the air conditioning to keep it colder.
Okay, so yeah, we're talking about two different things. Your coolant.
Oh.
So
okay.
Your radiator fluid, right? You heard of a radiator? What is your radiator for?
It keeps the car cool.
It keeps the car cool because we know that by it using gas, it starts to get hot, right? car gets hot.
Mhm.
So in the case of your radiator, the way your radiator works is sort of like how our blood circulates, right? So it circulates blood. So our arteries, our veins and arteries basically circulates blood through the body. Now this circulation also serves as a way of keeping the body cool, right? So when it's hot outside, we basically are gonna open up these blood vesicles, and then we're able to sit there and flow blood through it. When it's cold outside, we kind of close down these blood vessels. We open these guys up and keep these guys open. So it's kind of controlled in that sense as well too. So as in addition to like sweat and stuff like that, so we're gonna have sweat going on, help us cool us off. But the way our blood circulates also is gonna play a part. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. So in this case, blood is going to minimize when it's cold outside. It's going to minimize which vessels are going to be open and which are closed. So we're going to be able to close and open things accordingly. Right? So as it gets colder, you'll notice that the sensory, in a sense, your sensories aren't working as well, partially because your blood isn't flowing as well. Right? So our blood is only limited closer to those arteries that are deeper in the skin. Okay, rather than at the surface. Okay. Okay. Questions, concerns, Cash. Small chapter. Okay, so let's see. So when we age, does our skin age, or do I look like I looked when I was younger?
Our skin ages.
Our skin ages, right? Okay. So as we age, one of the first thing that we notice, we start to get the bubble, get a little loose skin. So the skin gets a little bit loose. So that elasticity, right? So remember, we're constantly going through and making those changes. So that elastin. Well, if you guys had a pair of shorts that you had since you were in high school or in junior high, and they're my favorite shorts. I'll never get rid of these shorts. Guys,
they're the PJ shorts.
Yeah, right. So you have those shorts that you've had, right? And then over time, that elastic keeps getting bigger and bigger, right? And so
it kind of wore off already.
or completely off, right? So that's essentially what's happening again with our skin, right? So over time, it's stretching and getting bigger and bigger. And so then our skin is going to get looser, right? And part of that, there's two things that are kind of going on. So we're not producing as much stuff as we were producing when we were younger, right? So we're not producing the elastins the way that we were producing when we were younger. We're not producing the collagen the way we were producing when we were younger. And so you'll notice that those changes start to occur. And that's why a lot of people go get plastic surgery and stuff like that, hips and tucks and stuff like that, because that skin is getting looser over time, right? We age, right? We can't avoid it. Our hair thins, right? Our hair color changes, right? So why don't we have dark hair anymore? Why is it all white, right? So because we're not producing the proteins at the levels that we were producing when we were young, and as a result of that, we age, right? So those cells aren't doing what they're supposed to be doing, okay? So often we'll go get Botox, nips and tucks, right? To sit there and help us collagen, add it to our lips, okay? So the other thing that I wanted to talk about is, and just kind of brush on it, is vitamin D synthesis, right? So they tell you you need sun for vitamin D, right? So you need a little bit of UV light for vitamin D. So that UV light does activate the synthesis of vitamin D production, okay? And so the particular one that we're looking at is vitamin D3, because there's a couple of Ds. One is mood, one is that. They kind of play into each other as well too, okay? So we want to make sure that we're making vitamin D, because vitamin D is needed for cholesterol production. And so we want that healthy cholesterol. So we need a little bit of sunlight. We don't want to be out in the sun all day, but we need a little bit. If you don't have enough sunlight, you get a disease called Rickets. Have you guys heard of it? So Rickets, so vitamin D is is going to be used for bone production. So, you know, you get vitamin D from milk. You guys notice that? You see on the side vitamin D, right? We also get it from sun, right? So we need the sun there for the production of that. So we need that vitamin D for development of bones, right? Correctly. Rickets is basically when it's when you don't have enough vitamin D in the body. And so as a result of it, your bones don't shape the right way. And so you'll be bow-legged. You'll be, you know, your bones will kind of bow out. They won't form like straight the way that they should. And they'll be a little bit brittle, right? So it also affects that calcium absorption for bone development. Okay. And so we need that. So we need the epidermis to sit there and get a little bit of UV light, not too much, but just enough to sit there and help the synthesis of vitamin D. Okay.
But is that the same as supplementing? Like, do you get the same effects?
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, to some extent, because our body doesn't absorb as much as we should, right? When we take it orally. Okay, compared to like, so if you go out in the sun just a little bit, your whole body, well, most of your body, you know, your arms, your legs and stuff like that, get a little bit of sun, take a walk out in the sun. So it's getting that whole body, and all of those cells are able to sit there and do it. If we take it as a supplement, you're basically taking it orally. So you're relying on, first off, enough of it has to be absorbed, you know, in the gut, and then that has to be delivered, right? And so that bioavailability is a lot less when you take it orally. So it's coming from that central point, where the other places is coming from all of your body. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So one is definitely much better than the other. So like most of the vitamins that you take orally, you pee or poop out, right? And so you'll notice the color of your pee changes when you take a lot of vitamins or a lot of supplements, right? Most of that is going out. So the best way of getting it is getting it naturally, but you're limited, you know, a supplement can help because you're at least getting some of it. And if you actually look at it, if you look at the percentages of the supplement, a lot of them is like 500 times of what you actually need. The reason why it's 500 times of what you actually need is because most of it you're just going to pee out anyway. Okay. Okay, so there are certain diseases that are going to be skin and injury of the skin, or just injury of the skin in general, right? So we have a basal cell carcinoma, so another form, like you said, skin cancer. Okay. So these guys are, if they're caught early, it's curable and stuff like that. And a lot of times it has to do with they basically cut it out and cut that area out. But there's also some immunotherapies that have been very effective for the treatment. So as with any form of cancer, basically the cell is totally out of control. And in this case, these are particularly these stem cells that are found in your Stratium basal. So that's why they call it basal cell carcinoma. So we have the Skirmish cell carcinoma. Again, it tells you where the cell comes from. In this case, you're starting from a skirmish cell. And again, these guys are treatable, but in this context, you're getting lesions, right? So in the other context, you're getting like a mole, a mole-like substance or a mole-like exposure, but you're also still getting, if you notice, look at the veins and stuff like that. There's a lot of cancer cells. What happens is that you start getting development of arteries in the wrong spots and not enough oxygen being provided in other spots, and that causes these issues as well in terms of feeding that cancer. Okay, so this here is, in this case, this person has had it for a lot longer than what they should have, so they didn't get treated in the early enough time, and so you're starting the development of lesions in that area. So this is also a skirmish cell carcinoma. So that person that had the lesions, I'm sorry, my bad. That's the wrong title. So this is Skirmish carcinoma. This guy is actually a sorry, hold on, let me fix that slide.
Is that you right there?
Is that me?
Yeah.
What do you mean? Oh, yeah, in the water? Yeah, all the time. No, actually, I did. I went to Costa Rica, was it 2 years ago, 3 years ago now? I think it's 3 years ago now. 3 years ago. And I actually did this. It was so much fun. The only thing, I also had dreads. The only thing, my dreads were a lot longer during that time period. And there's these school of fish, and they just surrounded me. And they were just, I'm like, oh, this is so cool. I'm swimming with the fishes, right? Really, they were really attracted to my dreads, and they kept trying to eat at my dreads. And so it was crazy when I realized what was going on, you know.
This is while you were snorkeling, or?
Yeah, yeah. It was, but it was cool. I can't complain. Stuff. Okay. Sorry about that. This is what happens when you try to make slides late at night when you really should be sleeping. I have a tendency when I have a lot of things on my mind, I wake up in the middle of the night, 1, 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, sitting over me. And so I'm like, I can't sleep. So I'm like, okay, I'm going to get up and make some slides. Okay, let's see. Okay, so this guy, so this guy is actually a melanoma. So, and it's typically, it's shown as either a brown or black patch. If you kind of look at it, the surface is raised a little bit, but it's not like compared to what we saw with the. Can you guys see my screen? Oh yeah. So when we're talking about the basal cell carcinoma, it's raised significantly, and then you also have, like I said, that veiny type of look to it, right? Where these guys are just going to be a dark spot. They're going to have some raise to it, but it's not going to be to the level that you saw with the basal cell. Okay. You guys have heard of eczema?
Yeah, my little brother has it really bad.
Okay. So eczema basically is where you're getting a lot of cell death, a lot more than what you should. And so you get this red flaky rash because the cells are dying faster than what they're supposed to. And so again, this is another example, right? So in the case of cancerous cells, you have cells that are just growing like crazy. In this case, you have cells that are dying like crazy. Okay, so acne, we've kind of talked about acne before. So here's an example of how that process works. So we have that hair follicle. The hair follicle basically gets plugged. And so we start producing more and more oil underneath that skin and more oil underneath the skin. And then our cells start to send signals saying, hey, something is wrong. So it gets all nice and red and puffy. And so then we get our nice little zit, right? Okay. So often when a person is burnt, and so our degree of burning is dependent on how much of the epidermis is basically affected. So a first degree burn is going to go just like that first layer. So it's just the epidermis. And then a second-degree burn goes deeper. A third-degree burn goes through the epidermis and the dermis. And then the fourth-degree burn is like we've gone to the hypodermis. Okay. So when we talk about burns, we kind of, it basically is dependent on how far they go. So the other day I was cooking and I burnt myself on the surface of the pan, right? Because I wasn't paying attention. I rubbed my arm on the pan, so I have a nice little mark. And so it's just basically that outer layer, right? It's the epidermis. So is that a first-degree burn, a second-degree burn, or a third-degree burn, or fourth-degree burn? First. Okay. So again, so it's just the base, it's dependent on how far we go in. Okay. So there are guidelines for treating burns depending on how bad they are and how much of the area. And so often doctors will depend, they will base it upon that. Okay. Questions, concerns, Cash? I feel like I'm missing something else. So we talked about burns. So let's talk about a little about injuries, right? So we know that wounds and scars and stuff like that are part of that process. We actually talked about scarring when we talked about tissues, right? So a lot of scar tissues have what we call keloids. You heard of keloids?
Yes.
So occasionally, particularly like people of color, people like me, I actually produce a lot of keloids. Keloids are basically when you overproduce scar tissue. So like I have a nice little cut on my leg and it's all raised up. It's really dark in surface. And so that has a lot of keloids. So sometimes people have the same thing happen when they have acne. So people that are had a bad case of chickenpox or things like that. So they'll basically have high keloid production, and then that tissue becomes raised and it has a lot of fibers and stuff that are going to be associated with it and is not being absorbed. And so the treatment, there's really no good way of treating it. A lot of times they'll try to cut it out, or they'll say, okay, if you rub on it and massage it with like lotions and stuff, that'll actually start reducing some of the scar tissue. And that's what you essentially want to do. And then eventually, sometimes they'll do abrasions. They'll have you rub it with like salts and stuff like that, or sands, sit there and kind of scrape it down to lower layers.
Can you get a keloid from like tattoos, huh?
Yes, you can get keloids from tattooing as well too. And like that's one of the reasons why I don't want to get tattoos, because I know that I get a lot of keloids just by wounds themselves. And then once they're there, unless I take the time to get them, burnt off or things like that. And I still have to be careful in that way as well. Bed sores. You guys know what bed sores are? You guys are probably becoming more prone to bed sores now, since we spend a lot of time sitting on our butts in front of the computer. So bed sores are basically when it typically happens in the elderly, and it's a result of you basically not getting enough blood flow and not moving and stuff like that. You start getting sores that are starting to develop in that area. So a lot of times those sores will start from like a little small bacterial infection or just sometimes being in body fluids for a little bit. So you get necrosis of certain tissues. So area starts to die as a result of not having enough blood flow, not having enough circulation, not moving. And so since that area is dying, it becomes bigger and bigger and bigger. So you could end up with like something that started off as a really small bed sore. It ends up breaking something else. We've been sitting on our butts a lot lately, and I noticed that I get like a little sore. And so I'm like, okay, I got to get my butt up and try to walk out around a little bit, since I've been teaching so much on the laptop all day long. So it basically, because we're not getting that blood flow in those areas, it ends up leading to necrosis. You guys remember what necrosis is?
Cell death.
Cell death. and it's not programmed cell death, it's accidental cell death. So in this case, because I'm sitting on my butt, my blood is not flowing the way it's supposed to, and as a direct result of that, that area starts to die, right? Or it can be led from a simple infection or something like that. Stretch marks. What are stretch marks?
Scarring from stretching.
What was that?
I said scarring from
Scarring from
stretching.
stretching. Yes. Okay, so stretch marks are basically scarring from stretching. So a lot of people who lift weights, I think, Ariel, you're here, right? So you have a program. You guys have to go work out a lot, right? You have so many hours you have to do in the gym when you're actually playing sports. Anybody else play sports? Let me just ask that. Anybody works out? Go to lifting weights.
Yes.
Right. Okay, so if you get too big too fast, what happens is your skin starts to stretch. So our skin is elastic, but if we try to get too much growth too fast, we'll end up with stretch marks. Get too fat too fast, we eat too much, we end up with stretch marks. We have babies, they end up with stretch marks, right? So if it happens too fast, then you get so much growth that elasticity, you go beyond that point of elasticity. And so those elastins start breaking, so you're no longer there. And so you actually end up with stretches. So it stretches that skin. So that's what stretch. It typically happens through rapid weight gain, muscle building, when you're going through points of development. So what is a catalyst? I mean, not a callus, callus.
Is it like buildup of dead skin cells?
That's right. It is the buildup of dead skin cells. Okay. So basically we've gotten those skin cells are thickening. And so in the epidermis, which is normally not too thick, it becomes thicker and it has large layers of dead skin cells in a certain area. And so usually it's a result of an injury, damage, something like that. Or let's say, how many of you guys have worked in the fields? I had to chop cotton before summer, and I used this hoe and I had calluses on here. So again, it's just a combination of dead skin. Okay. Okay, so are there any questions? Concerns? So since you guys have the exam this week, I'm not going to give you a lab because I can't find a lab for the skin, and I wanted to think about a lab for the skin. So I'll save those labs. I'll have 2 labs for when you guys get back from spring break for you. The only thing that you guys have to do is feed your fish, and I wanted you guys to do this fish stimulant. I forgot to make up that lab for you. So I wanted you to treat your fish with, but we'll wait till you guys get back. So when you guys get back, you'll do the fish lab. Just keep your fish alive. Right.
Okay.
Okay. So you'll have a skin lab and a fish lab. And maybe a skin fish lab. So, okay.
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 Okay. You guys have a good break. Come back refreshed, ready to go, because we're going to prime it up and it's going to go into 2nd and 3rd gear.